Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of Cut the Crop. And today we have Ivan Lawrie from FAR and we're going to be talking milling wheat. So as you probably know, we have been looking at various opportunities over the last 18 months to try and grow the amount of milling wheat in New Zealand. And Ivan's been one of the lead players in that initiative. So let's talk about what we've been trying to achieve and what have we achieved.
So I'll start off by saying that cereal grains and wheat in particular are a key part of our arable rotations in New Zealand. So without having that grain phase in the rotation, we would be unable to have the wide variety of crops that we grow and high-value seed crops, etc. So it is a real key important link in that chain. In saying that, we've always been looking at how can we add value to that part of the chain so that it maintains high profitability for the rest of the system. Since deregulation in the late 80s, early 90s, the story around milling wheat has had many cycles in New Zealand. The story has been that there's been a decreased volume in milling wheat over time, and that particular grain has lost traction against other more attractive propositions from growing, say, feed wheats, which are higher yielding, or feed barley, into the animal industry. So looking at adding value, it was really important to see how we could give more importance to the milling wheat side of the story and re-engage with the rest of the industry to make this happen in a coordinated way.
And did we achieve that?
I think we have achieved it partially, and I think we have made some good inroads into it. There are many pieces to this puzzle that we do not control, and as late as today, in fact, we've had news of major changes in the flour milling industry and the way they purchase grain from the growers. And in a small market like New Zealand, any change of ownership, any change of purchasing power has an immediate impact to growers. And in a way, that becomes a factor that is out of the grower's control.
But this is the frustrating thing, is that no matter what we try to do within the established supply chain, we will always not be the group that has the decision-making power. And the only way that growers could potentially add value would be if we disrupted the supply chain or we drove consumer demand. And so let's just talk through some of the things that we've done to try and identify whether, in fact, those ideas have any legs.
Yeah, and so resulting from an early part of the initiative was a workshop we carried out in February 2019, of which two work streams evolved. One of them was looking at the constraints around supply and the constraints that we have in New Zealand around infrastructure and transport and storage, especially when trying to move grain from South Island to North Island. And we know and we are aware of the shortfall that we have in infrastructure for this. The other work stream was actually focused on understanding the consumer and how important is it for the New Zealand consumer to have an awareness of where the flour and where the wheat that makes the flour in their products actually comes from. So I think it's really important that we have the horse before the cart in this sense, and that we understand that this is only going to be driven by a consumer demand targeting products that have local produce contained in them.
So we did a market survey. what came out of that survey? Did it support what we were trying to achieve?
Absolutely. We conducted a market survey, and I must clarify that this was done before COVID. So this was before we got that extra boost from the awareness of home cooking, etc. In that survey, which was done on almost 1,000 consumers of purchasers of bread in New Zealand, the survey identified that 51% of consumers would be happy to pay up to 50 cents more per loaf of bread if they could prove that that bread was made with New Zealand grown grains. A further 13% of that consumer survey indicated that there was a group of people who would be able to pay up to maybe 20 cents more a loaf of bread. So collectively, there was an indication that 2/3 of the bread consumers in New Zealand would be happy to pay a few cents more per loaf if it was proven that that was New Zealand grain.
So we did that survey and we talked about those results within the supply chain, with the millers and the bakers. And we didn't necessarily get an acknowledgement that could occur. I remember sitting in these meetings and the feedback was, well, we just don't believe that there is a premium for New Zealand grain. So, and then when we teased that out, there were a number of reasons put forward by various groups in the supply chain about why why people don't buy New Zealand grain at the moment and why potentially the supply chain wouldn't necessarily deliver that. So talk us through, what the reasons were for why New Zealand grain shouldn't be a dominant part of our bread and baked products.
So the typical and recurring reasons around New Zealand wheat, I think, are around an original perception that because in pre-80s era, the quality of New Zealand milling wheat wasn't particularly good, that some of those preconceived ideas about quality have lingered on. Some of those might be more substantiated than others, but it is also true that whilst there had been questions around the quality of our own milling wheat, the quality of our imported milling wheat has also gone down, and the consistency and the quality of that wheat that we used to import, in particular from Australia, is no longer perceived as being so fantastic as it used to be. So we're living in a world where there are multiple factors. Yes, it is true that we have higher moisture in our grains in New Zealand, because that's just the way we operate, and that is the way that international standards have been set for moisture. Australian wheat, of course, is extremely dry because they have extreme dry harvest conditions. That presents a slight advantage in terms of your purchasing wheat because you're obviously purchasing less water, if you like, contained in that shipment. The other argument that is always put against us is, Australian wheat is hard and it's strong. Well, the genetics have advanced in New Zealand over the last 2.5 decades to such an extent that some of our strongest wheats in New Zealand are actually stronger than the Australian imports. And in fact, probably too strong for some of the mechanical dough processing and the let's say mass manufactured bread that New Zealand requires today. So that's myth number 2 that can be counteracted with the development of really, really good cultivars in New Zealand for New Zealand conditions. And then, of course, there is the white wheat versus red wheat argument, which, again, you can have a higher extraction rate of flour from white wheat because you can mill it harder and it will not color the flour. But again, with their very small percentage points, and we're working with the millers to fully understand those extraction rates.
So how do we make sure that we can bring robust data to the table to be able to refute, these perceptions that are out there amongst bakers, amongst retailers about the quality of New Zealand grain?
So the first thing was to collect and collate all the data that we actually have on recent New Zealand wheat varieties and their quality and performance, and be able to compare those to imported Australian wheat. The only way to do that was to capture as many samples we could through our CPT trial system, which FAR runs along with the industry, and to actually gather all the tests and bake tests and quality information from flour over the years that have been captured and put them into one document. So we've actually commissioned a research team to put together an independent review on the quality of New Zealand wheat, so we have that data available. The second point, I guess, is understanding what the carbon footprint of New Zealand wheat actually is and comparing that to that of imports. And that's a second report which we have commissioned to do, to be able to have the tools and the information readily available to millers, to bakers, and in particular to the consumers as to what that quality story around New Zealand provenance wheat actually is.
So if we have some data that shows the consumers would really like to buy bread and baked products that have come from New Zealand grain, and we've got data that shows that New Zealand grain can produce as good quality produce as imported grain, what would be the reasons that the existing supply chain wouldn't want to deliver that product to the consumers? I'll
go back to the beginning, Alison, and say that this started off as an industry-wide initiative, bringing together through AFIC the millers, the traders, the bakers, the growers, research, and slowly, obviously, you understand that in that process, some groups have more vested interests in this process to actually be successful than others. And it's very difficult sometimes to get collaboration from everybody if not everybody is on exactly the same path. So soon it was identified that it should be the growers and FAR to lead the process, to do the investment, because it's in our own interest to do so. I think what we learned from there on was that people will engage and give their support verbally to things that sound appealing and that probably in their heart they truly believe. But when it comes to hitting the harsh commercial realities and the interests and ownerships of some of these companies, it is key to be talking to actually who the decision makers really are. And those people are sometimes not the ones that we're dealing with on a daily basis.
So where do we take this? I mean, if we make an assumption, New Zealand grain is as good quality, and that New Zealand consumers do want to have the option of purchasing bread, or some New Zealanders do, a segment of the consumers out there, how can we move this initiative forward? What are the next things that we're going to try and do?
Well, I think as an industry, it is important we get our story out there. And when I say we get our story out there, I'm not referring to the farmer communications. It's really important to get out there in the media. And I know that FAR is making efforts in this sense. Get the consumer to actually know where their bread comes from, in particular in the North Island, where we know that wheat that is being milled is predominantly 90% imported. There are 230,000 tons of milling wheat imported from Australia in this current year. We are struggling to get enough New Zealand milling wheat to exceed 100,000 tons. Even though we've made progress, we'd hit rock bottom in 2018 with, I think, just under 70,000 tons. We managed to bring that back up again to over 100,000 tons, thanks to earlier contracts, thanks to better understanding and communication with the mills. But that's only a small part of the puzzle. We've also got to be very careful in our terminology. We don't want this to be seen as protectionism or regulation. We want to have free competition based on the merits of our own product and the fact that the consumers want it.
And so does that mean then that our focus is very much then on consumer awareness, making consumers aware of where actually their bread products come from, and I guess explaining to them that there is the opportunity for New Zealand growers to provide 100% New Zealand produce?
Absolutely. It can only be driven from the consumer. That is the only way we can do it. But as I say, it is important not only for FAR and the growers, it is also important for the seed companies and the plant breeding companies who put an enormous effort into developing New Zealand milling wheat varieties that are well adapted to our environment. And if we're going to make this grow, we're going to have to make it grow as an industry, all of us together. At the moment, it seems that it's a really hard push from the growers to try and get this over the line. And I think the seed companies are working with us closely and understand the problem because they are affected by it just as much as the growers. But ultimately, bakers and millers have choices. They can go and purchase grain overseas, or they can go and purchase flour overseas if they so want to. As growers, we need to try and find products that can maximize returns, that are appealing to the consumer, and that long-term can have consistency. It's not a question of getting a good price for milling wheat this year and say, hooray, we got $460 this year for our wheat, and then next year we get $380. It has to have a degree of consistency. So these are the things we're looking at, mechanisms where growers and millers can work together for a longer term agreement.
So I know that you have been engaging with, the artisan bakers. Is your thinking that it may be easier to drive the initiative at a small scale first, and hopefully a few successes and runs on the board with some of the high-profile artisan bakers or retailers that might actually drive a slight behavioural change with the big boys sitting in the established supply chain?
Artisan baking, the analogy I give it is a bit like craft brewing. I think once a new style of bread or a special style of pastry or baking becomes fashionable, it kinds to drive behavior in the rest of the consumers and grow that market for that product, make it more mainstream, if you like. So I think it's a good angle, and I think having some good flagship organizations to work with us in putting forward the advantages of New Zealand wheat and the traceability of New Zealand wheat is really good. And we actually are a bit puzzled as to why companies who are already using New Zealand wheat and whom we know are large organizations who have committed to the use of New Zealand wheat aren't making more of a noise about it. We would like to see that advertised as a major selling point for them.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are companies out there who, you Google their website and it says, we proactively look to source, local ingredients, and that they use New Zealand grain, but they choose not to tell the consumer that they use New Zealand grain. Why do you think that is?
I guess one of the factors might be a historical fear of lack of consistency of supply, because if you commit your product to be made with New Zealand wheat and then for some reason you hit a roadblock in which you cannot access enough product, you could be in trouble. That is not the case. What we want to try and show is that we have the ability to produce a lot more milling wheat than we grow, that the growers, there's a core group of growers who are really, really good at producing quality wheat and who would be keen to produce more rather than go and produce mainstream feed products. But it just needs to have continuity from both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess What do you say to growers who might challenge FAR and say, why are you involved in this kind of work? This is not research. What's our justification? Why are we doing this for the growers?
Well, as you know, Alison, and I'll go back to my first comment around the crops in the rotation, the main crop that FAR collects the levy from its growers is cereal grain. And that is a reality, and it's been quite consistent over the 25 years that FAR has been in existence, that cereal grains represent about 50% of that rotation. If we can add value to extract a higher end product from that 50%, give it the New Zealand provenance story, we would be really contributing to the whole size of the arable economy. Now, that we can fight for this idea and put all our effort behind it, and that the result might be, well, the consumer doesn't want New Zealand milling wheat. That is not what the surveys are telling us. If the survey hadn't told us that the New Zealand consumer has an interest, we would have probably given up by now and just let nature take its course.
Yeah. So, you mentioned in the survey that, there's a segment of the consumers out there who would be willing to pay up to, well, let's just say, mid-range, an extra 30 cents on a loaf of bread, let's say on a $2.50 loaf of bread. What kind of difference would that make to if some of that was fed back down the supply chain to the grower? What kind of difference would that make to the grower?
It would make a huge difference, because in any loaf of bread today, be it a $1 loaf of bread or a $6.99 artisan ciabatta, there is about 38 to 40 cents worth of wheat in it. Mm. So if by some miracle of value chain, you could put the extra cents going back on that loaf of bread to the value on the wheat that goes back to the grower, a very, very small change in cents would have a huge impact on the price going back to the grower. Now, we're not saying that it is only the grower who needs to have access to that benefit. Everybody in the value chain should benefit from a New Zealand story and a provenance, and ultimately to provide good, sustainable, traceable products to the New Zealand consumer in general. As I say, that the artisan side is a fantastic story, but it's not it doesn't necessarily it's not available to all consumers in income brackets in New Zealand. But the story around it and the type of product that is delivered always tends to bring up the standards right across the market.
Yeah, and we know that, because we're in the middle of COVID and that's going to go on for a while. I mean, there is now an increasing consumer awareness of wanting to know where their food comes from and wanting to make sure that their food is safe and that it has been produced by sustainable sort of, practices. So, our survey, which was done pre-COVID, there should be no reason that it's not actually even more of a value proposition for us, now than it was then.
Look, I always tell this story. On the Wednesday before lockdown, I popped into the supermarket, not because I necessarily had to buy anything. I just wanted to see what was going on with the purchases on the shelves. And there was no lack of toilet paper, no lack of hand sanitizer, but there was absolutely no flour on the shelves. There was no bread on the shelves. And this very clearly told me that the first thing consumers do and households do when they want to protect their families is ensure that they have flour and bread in the pantry. Yeah. So it is a matter of food security, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So any take-home messages from you, Ivan, about what we're doing and what we hope to achieve?
Look, the take-home message at the moment is that we will continue to work with all the players in the industry who wish to work with us as an initiative. We are going to be quite strong about saying this is grower-led, because it is in our own interest to do so. We're also working on other strands that contribute to the milling wheat story, which is specialty grains, durum wheat in the Wairarapa, which I've spoken about, a very interesting regional story there with provenance and potential terroir for a pasta industry. There are other organizations working alongside with us on specialty grains for New Zealand. There's opportunities for spray-free and for organic grains as well. All of those can be part of the story, and it's not just the mainstream. So at the moment, the key thing here is to continue the work with the other industry bodies, but focus strongly on consumer awareness and getting the message out to the public that is not necessarily the public that is normally engaged with reading farm news.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Ivan. I think that time will tell, what kind of progress that we make, but I think it's really important that FAR tries to make this happen, because it will have a significant positive impact on our growers. And that's what the levy's all about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.